Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm honored and delighted today to welcome Dr. Kenneth Wang as our guest on Conversing. Kenneth serves as professor of psychology and head of the PhD program at Fuller Theological Seminary's School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. He comes from a Taiwanese background, is fluent in Mandarin, in Taiwanese, in English. He's a core member of Fuller's China Initiative, and his research interests have included the topic of perfectionism. It's an area that we're going to be exploring in some depth today, and I'm delighted that he's our guest. Kenneth, thank you so much for joining us on Conversing today.
Yeah, it's my honor. Thank you for having me, Mark.
Well, I have loved the years that we overlapped at Fuller, and I'm delighted to have you, and I'm especially delighted that we get to have a chance to jump into one of the main research fields that you've been exploring, which is perfectionism. I think it would be natural to start about a discussion about perfectionism on the personal level, but I want to start in the opposite direction today. I'd like to start with societal perfectionism, because in a way that I think has really been striking to me is that as our society becomes ever more technologized and ever more, therefore, able to be in the finest details of programming, algorithms, productivity, production quality, all of these things that have driven us toward an even greater sense of getting it, quote, just exactly right, feels like it's establishing a different kind of overall sensibility. And while it may be particularly true in the United States, you know better than I do that there are places in Asia that see America as sort of slightly antiquated in its technology, and that really the greater standards are really in Asia more than they even are here. And there was already a lot of expectations of performance and perfect performance in Asian cultures. So I'm just curious, let's start. How do you see perfectionism affecting our lives today on the macro scale?
Yeah, so I think, like you mentioned, Mark, I think with technology, there's so many things that we can edit, so many opportunities to do over again. And I think with the social media, we're exposed to content that has been edited, that has been selected out of 1,000 tries or so. So it does raise our sense of perfection. And especially when we compare with others, we feel like we're not good enough. I can't talk like people who are like the influencers online and how smooth they are. And it's stressful. And I think even this past weekend, I was with my 12-year-old nephew, and he was trying to shoot backwards through a basket from a far distance. So I videoed him. I probably videoed 50 times, and finally he got in once. But then it was the one that I saved, I sent to our relatives, and it looked awesome. It looked so easy and cool. So I think that's what it does to us.
Oh my gosh. We can edit anything but the perfect shot.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great metaphor for what we're talking about. I do think it creates additional psychological and social burdens on us that make it really onerous. I mean, I think when I stepped down as the president of Fuller, no one on the staff that worked closely with me would say that I was anything but a non-technology oriented person. That in fact, technology for me was an adaptive skill that came certainly well into the second half of my life and affected, and I would say I happily adapted in the sense that I was eager for its benefits. But I wouldn't say that I became actually fluent, which then the longer that goes on, the further out the technology develops, the more I was aware that I was not able to be, quote, perfect in my use of technology or even remotely. So, and some who know that story are probably, if they're listening to this, gently laughing about how true that was. But my point is really less about my story and more about what I think is just this general sensibility that we're constantly being measured. So, for example, a friend of mine worked for an investment firm where after every single meeting, every person at the meeting was to give a ranking number to every other person that was at the meeting about how they had performed in that meeting. And it was on a public scoreboard about how you had done. And every day you could see who had, quote, gotten the highest scores of that day. And so life every day, day in and day out, was microscopically managed. Now, that's an extreme example. I understand that. But I do think the ethos of that is not far off from a lot of people and a lot of people's experiences.
Yeah. I think, like what you mentioned, it feels like there's no time to relax or rest. You're constantly monitored, scrutinized. Especially, I think the hardest part is you're constantly compared with other people's. And it's like conditioning, socializing us to compare ourselves with others. And I think that's one thing that's underlying the challenges of perfectionism, is that we compare ourselves with others and we feel like we're not good enough. And then with social media, with access to much more comparisons, we're never going to be the best, or we're always going to find people who are good enough, who are better than us. And it reminds me of growing up in school. I grew up in Taiwan. So in school, we would have midterm exams, start elementary school, and two midterms, one final each semester. And after each exam, we would get a report card. And the report card would list every student's grades on every subject from number 1 to number 50, depending how many students. It was on one sheet of paper, so the same paper for everyone, and in order. So for Americans, they're like, oh, what? This is crazy. But that was our life.
Right.
And so we were very socialized to know how important grades are. And I think that's why Asian folks, we emphasize academics so much.
Right.
And I remember when I went back to Taiwan when I was in 5th grade, and I realized, okay, the society, at least in school, works different in the US. The people who are popular, they're not the best looking people. And they're not really extrovert or charismatic. They're not good at sports. They're good at academics. And they're on the top of the list on the report card. So quickly, I learned the importance of academics. And that's how you become popular, how you belong, how people respect and look up to you. So I think it has a huge impact on us, and psychologically. It does motivate us to do certain things, but I think it also gives us a lot of psychological weight and burden. It can be very stressful.
Yes, that is so extraordinary. It is an unimaginable, a literally unimaginable thing to think that that system would exist in an American school, unless somehow the parents had opted in, that they wanted their children to be in that kind of intensity, which I don't think very many parents have any interest in that occurring. So it's really a way of underscoring that really, really powerfully. So I think one of the things that also happens on the cultural level that I'd like you to comment on is, we're approaching the time when the Olympics are going to be occurring. And the Olympics are a global distillation of a quest for perfection, right? That's sort of the nature of it. Now, I realize it can be talked about in other terms. You could say it's not necessarily perfection, it's best performance, for example, or it's certainly winning a medal. But the whole idea is that everything about every competition is about ultimately who stands on the podium and who's specifically getting the gold medal. So, there's that pathway. There's also other competitive pathways, whether it has to do, interestingly, I think, even to our political moment right now in the United States. We have 2 presidential candidates that across the country, vast numbers of people find that there's no candidate that they actually really want to support. And why? Because they're not, quote, perfect. Now, I'm meaning it in a slightly different way, perhaps, than perfectionism. I'm meaning No one, no one would even remotely think that either of these candidates is perfect. But what I mean is that there's this yearning for the very best of the best, depending on which it is that you think you're facing. And part of the heaviness of the critique is that both sides leave voters wanting in such a degree. There's such a shortfall, depending on which political position you might have, of the other person. And it's because it's so far off the standard, which I'm using for the moment to generalize, about a sense of contentment that there's two really good candidates, and we're choosing one of two good candidates, as opposed to the position we're in now, where millions of people in America would say, whether it's fair to each candidate or not, it's a choice between two bad choices. So, so I'm saying that because it feels like even that is in part driven by this culture of performance at the very least. So talk to me a little bit about performance in relation to, and maybe in distinction from, perfectionism, because they are clearly intertwined. Perfectionism is always about some sort of performance, but I'm meaning more, what is the goodness of performance? What's the goodness of perfectionism? Are they the same things, or is it really quite different?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that's the first time I got this question. So let me reflect a little bit about that. So, of course, I think when we think about perfectionism, we think about it as a personality trait.
Right.
It's how we tend to respond, how we tend to think, react to certain situations. And perfectionism, there's two core dimensions of it. One is striving. It's having very high standards and focusing on striving to meet those standards, the excellence. And then the other aspect is a more maladaptive negative aspect. We call it discrepancy, or we call it evaluative concerns. So that part is the magnification of imperfection and being truly bothered by imperfection. So I can't stand anything that's not perfect. So even if I score 99 on a 100 test, I fixate on the 1 point. I magnify that 1,000 times and neglect the 99 points that I got. So that's perfectionism. And in terms of performance, perfectionism can be applied in different ways. A lot of time, most of the time, it's about performance. Of course, sometimes it's about neatness, it's about social relationships, but the performance is part of what perfectionists strive for. And I think aiming to perform well in itself is not a bad thing. Right. I think for the Olympic competitors, athletes, for them to work really hard, to strive to get a gold medal, to strive to break the world record, that's good. I think that's the goal of why they're competing. But I think the hard part is to not be able to tolerate imperfection. It's how to deal with the outcome of falling short of perfection or winning or achieving. And so for some people, they can try their best. And if they win a silver medal, they're disappointed, but after a while, they're okay. But for others, perfectionists, extreme perfectionists, they can't tolerate any imperfection, whether it's in the trials, in the practices, or let alone the actual Olympics or the competitions. And that's the hard part. So for perfectionists, especially the maladaptive ones, that they have to reach perfection. They can't deal with any imperfection.
So there is this, it's a different kind of elasticity in some sort of way. Is that the right analogy? That it's an incapacity to be able to respond back constructively, instead to just burrow in and ruminate probably on the imperfection that didn't make the perfect standard.
Yeah, a lot of rumination, a lot of shame, a lot of anxiety in the process.
Right.
So that it's the pain that comes with it.
So if you're going to give me an exam, which I invite you to do, on whether or not I'm a perfectionist, ask me the critical questions and I'll give you my answer, and you can tell me whether you think I'm where I am on the perfectionist scale.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll start with the basics. Do you have high standards for yourself? Do you feel like you need to be among the best?
I do.
Okay. So that's one of the core. And do you often feel like even though trying your best, you're still not good enough?
Yes.
do you magnify? Like, okay, if you're giving a talk and to 50 people, and there's one person kind of disengaged, not interested, but all the 49 are really interested, do you magnify the one person?
It depends on whether I know who that person is.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
But if it's just a person in the audience that doesn't seem to be connecting, no, that doesn't particularly bother me.
Okay, so that's good. So I think you are a perfectionist based on the standards that you have for yourself and that striving to achieve to be among the best. And in terms of the discrepancy part, it seems like, yeah, there's partially that, but not too much of it. So the discrepancy part is the inability to tolerate imperfection. And so you mentioned about, yeah, you always oftentimes feel like your best, even your best is not good enough. So you can identify
Yes.
the imperfection, but it doesn't seem like you're overly bothered by it. Like, for example, in the audience, one person versus 49. So you would be leaning towards more of an adaptive perfectionist. So there's two types of perfectionists. One is an adaptive. They strive for perfection, but they can tolerate imperfection, even though they notice it.
I have plenty
And
of
then-
opportunity to do that, as
Yeah,
an
yeah.
adaptive perfectionist would say.
Yeah. So I would say you're more like an adaptive perfectionist. In a maladaptive perfectionist, would the one person who's not engaged, it will kill them, and they'll feel like they're not successful,
Right.
and they just bombed the presentation.
Right. So, for example, obviously people often use the phrase, well, I did the best I could.
Mhm.
I could never imagine using that sentence. I don't believe I've ever spoken that sentence, partly because of what I think are these dynamics, namely, I'm sure I could always have done better.
Yeah.
And objectively, I'm often told that I could have done better by whatever measure that it might be that I'm considering at a given moment. That's a perfectionist instinct, right?
Yeah. So it's never perfect. We can always work harder. And I think sometimes that could lead to being a workaholic,
Right.
feeling like, okay, if I'm not working at this moment, then I'm lazy. I should be able to work harder. But on the other hand, if you're able to stop and to say, yeah, I could have tried, could have worked harder, but I think I worked appropriately, and that's good enough. And that's adaptive.
Right. Yeah, I think that is more my inclination. I do think that I remember, for example, the way this functions culturally is so interesting because and this is moving the conversation really to your research in Asian contexts and your experience as well. But I remember, for example, when I first moved to England, a culture that's this similar, heavily similar, with some distinctions. So I get picked up by a friend, taken to a gathering where I am meeting a number of other seminarians who are my age. I am about to get out of the car, and I say to this person that was standing right by the door to greet me, I said, hi. And he said, no, we do not say hi here. We say hello. I felt like, okay, then I'm not going to open my mouth because it felt like if I can't say a greeting and get it right, then I'm not about to just leap into conversation. So it was an example of a careful hearing of what I was saying, as kind of standard American British sort of critique or example of difference, right? And yet a readiness on his part to be sure that I was understanding that I was now in a new environment. So it was an example of cultural standards about what is, quote, appropriate, right, only right, exclusively right.
Yeah.
That plays in these various cultural spheres of how perfectionism gets written around what's happening externally.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I think for perfectionists, going across cultures can be really hard. I think trying to get things right, feeling like there's a right way of doing things versus wrong. And I think that person who greeted you, I don't think they were very culturally sensitive or friendly. They definitely didn't help. But I think for me, as someone who's been across two different cultures, the US and Taiwan, I struggle with, early on in my life, I struggle with wanting to fit in, wanting to act appropriately, wanting to be like others. And I realized it was very stressful. It felt like I oftenly had a radar,
Yes.
imaginary, invisible radar that is checking the room. How do people respond in meetings?
Yes.
How do you socialize? How
Yes.
do you end conversations? Did I say this wrong or did I say this wrong? It is so tiring
Yes.
that I
Yes.
have to feel like I need to do things the right way. And it can be throughout the whole day. So I realized I became more of an introvert because it took out so much energy
Yes.
in me
Yes.
to interact in cross-cultural settings. But
Right.
then this sabbatical, I spent time in Taiwan and Asia. I realized I really enjoy socializing and I can just be, I can relax. I feel like I belong. I feel like I can just be myself. And that was very enjoyable. So I think perfectionism intersecting with doing things the appropriate, right way, and especially we feel like we need to do things specific way or we can't be imperfect, that's very stressful. And I think language too is another issue when you go across cultures.
Yes.
So I did some studies on perfectionism and learning a second language,
Yes.
and also have some experiences taking students abroad and also working with international students. So language ability is not the key factor for international students' adjustment and well-being in studying the US. It's not their TOEFL scores, not their English ability. It's language apprehensiveness. That's the killer.
Right.
If you're like perfectionist and then you're afraid to say it wrong, so you don't say things and people interpret a certain way that you're not interested, you're not friendly, and they distant from you, and then you feel like people don't like you, and that's a killer. So
Right.
I think sometimes being able to just be ourselves and accept our imperfection is the way to do it. And another example, I brought a group of American students to Taiwan once. It was part of a bicultural immersion trip. And so typically when Taiwanese students interact with Americans, they tend to be very timid. And a lot of times they apologize, like, oh, my English is not good enough, and they're afraid to talk in English. And so what we trained our American students is that learn a little bit of Chinese, Mandarin. And then so when you go there, try to use your Mandarin and let them understand how your Mandarin is 10 times worse than their English. And then now when they're speaking their not so perfect English, they feel like they're accommodating you,
Yes.
not that they're not good enough
Yes.
to speak perfect English with you.
Yes.
And once our American students did that, it just broke the ice. And the Taiwanese students, they were able to relax and just converse and engage as opposed to worrying about their imperfect English because they know that that's the only way to communicate. Using Mandarin would definitely not work.
That is such a great example, Kenneth. I just recently taught in Hong Kong for a week. And one of the things that happened somewhat predictably was that at the beginning, for the first, you're only there with them for 5 days. It was 8 hours a day for 5 days, but nevertheless, it was just 5 days. So on the first day, knowing that there would be some tentativeness about this, and all of them were English speakers. All of them were English speakers,
Yeah.
not as their first language, but they had great language facility. But that apprehensiveness was really strong. And I did a number of things at the beginning to try to assure them that their English was actually really strong. Now, what really blew me away was that when I had finished the class and a number of weeks passed and their papers were due and they sent them to me, there was such a fluency of English in these papers that it was really remarkable. Now, I know that obviously conversational language is different than written language, and that when you can write something and refine it and proof it in various ways, it's going to be a different experience. But the English that I experienced from them in person would not have led me to believe that they could write with the English fluency on paper that they ended up demonstrating. And I think part of it was their tentativeness, at least for some of them, not all of them, but for some of them, a tentativeness around actually risking making certain statements or using certain words or whatever it might be. I certainly can say that for myself, I took a lot of French from junior high through college, and yet I don't speak French. I can read French, and I can read other written languages, obviously from seminary training, needing to learn Greek and needing to learn Hebrew, I studied German, but only as a written language, not as a conversational one. But certainly as an adult, the sense that you are fumbling with language is not an adult experience that I enjoy, right? So I think my desire, which has been true for some years, of learning Spanish has been seriously hampered by just feeling so self-conscious about making so many mistakes. So I have a theory that one of the reasons why some of the online language learning programs are so popular is partly that you can do all this now in private.
Yes,
At least
exactly.
you can go, it's not the same as doing it all in person, but you can go a long ways in language learning now in a safe zone where it's just you and your microphone and the recording process. So it's pretty amazing. Anyway, I just appreciate your example around language. I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. So tell us a little bit about the process of a person coming to terms with their perfectionism. I know that there's this, as you've said, there's this constructive side of the pursuit of excellence, we could call it. There's also the tendency to lean into obsessive compulsiveness in doing that.
Yes.
Let's just pause on that for just a minute. Is obsessive compulsiveness related to perfectionism, or are they actually two quite different things?
I would say there's a lot of overlap between the two. I would say in the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic criteria for psychological disorders, the closest diagnosis to perfectionism is OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So it's the strong need for control and predictability, neatness, organization, and that's pretty much like perfectionism. It's different from OCD, the disorder where you repeatedly do things, but it's more so the personality trait that overlaps with perfectionism.
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction. So there's the positive side, and then there's this deeply self-critical side. Now, some of that has to do with simply being non-perfect people. So regardless of whatever standard, we are all imperfect, whatever perfectionism we might be chasing. But talk about the deepest seed beds from which the negative perfectionism arises.
Yeah. So there are a few underlying parts. I think it's one's view of themselves. They tend to have an insecure view of themselves. They tend to seek validation, and the validation can come through their performance, achievement, measurable stuff, and their sense of self-worth is not stable, so they constantly need the validation. And then when they don't get the validation, they feel really awful about themselves. And oftentimes perfectionists have an all or nothing thinking. It's either perfect or imperfect. So if you get any negative thing, you're just trash. You're nothing.
Right.
And so it's the conditional self-worth based on perfectionism, being perfect, achievement, and then intersecting that with the all or nothing thinking. And then there's that fear of failure, fear of rejection, because your worth is incorrectly defined by your achievement.
And let's pause on that for just a second. Is that instinct for that kind of way of critiquing yourself in that moment, is that driven principally by external reality, or is it more an internal reality, or does it just vary person by person?
Yeah, I think it would vary by person, but I think for perfectionists, it's a lot internal.
Yes.
It's part of their personality trait.
Yes.
So they magnify the imperfection.
Yes.
And then that pains them because it just looks 20 times bigger than anything good that they've done.
So let's keep going down that vein for just a minute then. So is it pushing it too far to say that given that it has to do with something that's deeply internal more than something that's external, performance and being in that master grid that you suggested in your Taiwanese classroom at the top of the list, rather than it being that list, it's the inner story of how a person is talking to themselves about whatever their performance actually was. That's actually the main driver of this deficiency, this sense of self-erasing.
Yeah.
If you don't get the highest score, that's more internal than external.
Yes, it's internal. And sometimes I like to use the analogy of perfectionists having an inner critic that's constantly talking to them.
Yes.
That's constantly finding their imperfection and magnifying that.
Right.
And it can be really painful. I can give you an example. I'm a recovering perfectionist, and I just gave a talk on perfectionism, a workshop to Accenture, which is a consulting firm. There are about 500 people who attended, and I think it went pretty well based on my standards. And then at the end, I was supposed to leave 10 minutes for the organization that I was collaborating with, for them to share about their mental health service. But I ended up only leaving 5 minutes, and then I felt like they were rushed. And that killed me. After the presentation, I got some comments like, "Oh, this was awesome, spectacular." But I was like, no, but I messed up. I didn't control time well enough. And that bothered me for a day. And I sent an email to apologize to the person who was supposed to have 10 minutes. And before she responded, it was just weighing on me.
Yes.
Like, this is, I wish I could have just cut out some of this so that she would have the time.
Yes.
And I finally got her email today, and she responded with a lot of praise about how the workshop went. And she also said it was okay. And that was super relieving. But before getting that email, it just weighed on me that it was imperfect. And that part was 10 times more than the good part that I did.
Yes. That is so interesting, both because I've had that exact experience myself, and also because of the trail on, which is you're writing an apology and then her responding. Now, in her response, when she said it was okay, are you able to then release and forgive yourself? Is that the part of being a recovering perfectionist? And that a perfectionist that's not in recovery would actually say it doesn't really matter that you've accepted it and that you've said it was okay because I know that it was wrong. Is that how the narrative would have gone?
Yeah, I think there's different layers and at different steps.
Yes.
So I think for me, I was relieved after she was okay because I think maybe the thing that bothered me the most was what I did impacted her. And then I think there's this people-pleasing part of me. I feel like I need to please everyone, or else it's not okay. And so I think for me, that sort of helped. But also the recovering part is how I dealt with my emotions during the 24 hours before I received that email. So I was aware of it, and then I made a note of what happened, and I know it's an inner critic. It's not reality. And what I tend to do is I have a log on my cell phone in my notes. I list down these things that I'm like, that imperfection or the things that really bother me. And then I just list it. There's a couple reasons that I find it helpful. One is when I'm ruminating over something, it's because there's a fear of like something bad will happen because of this. And so I can't let go of it because if I forget, something bad would happen. So I write it down so I can take this out of my head and know it's on my phone. I won't forget it. So I don't need to, I can let go of that fear of forgetting. And another part is that it gives me evidence that, okay, I write this down, and then after a few months, I can go back and look at it and see, okay, these things happened before. And 80% of them or 90% of them turn out to be okay. So I have empirical data to say that the likelihood it feels like 90% that there's going to be a catastrophizing disaster. But actually, based on data, it's only 10 or 20% that something bad will happen. So those are some things that's helpful. And then also another one is that I treat it as a mental workout session. So a lot of times for us to build physical muscles, we go to the gym to lift weights or we go on jogs. And the process isn't actually fun. Jogging, lifting weights, there's some stretching, some pain, but then we have to do it to get better.
Right.
And I think our mental resilience, especially to negative emotions or to imperfection, is because we haven't trained our muscles
Right.
as good enough. I think for perfectionists, you try to not make mistakes, so you haven't encountered as much mistakes as people who don't care. And so I see it as an opportunity for me to have a mental workout session to enhance my ability to cope with imperfection. And so I reframe it from a failure or something bad to, okay, this is a workout session. I'm going to my mental gym. And then this 24 hours, I'm wrestling with this, but I'm not going to let it overwhelm me. But I know, it doesn't feel good, but that's like when we do exercises, when we're building muscles, stretching, it doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So that's what I did. And then the last thing I did was I'm trying to sit with my negative emotions. I think for perfectionists, I think sometimes we know the right way to think, but the emotions are the part that's hard to cope with. And then an easy way is try to distract ourselves and just try to not feel it and just bury ourselves in work or do something fun. But then we don't really get better at sitting with our emotions. So I've been trying to sit with my emotions. And I've created this coping method for myself is to make a kinzuki when
You might explain what that is, just so
sit with
everyone knows.
emotions. Yeah. So I'll share this. So this is a pottery. And then this is a kinzuki. So kinzuki is a Japanese art. It's an art of repairing broken pottery. And the philosophy behind it is that typically when we repair something broken, we want to make the cracks as invisible as possible. We want to, so people don't see the cracks. But instead, the philosophy of kinzuki is that the brokenness of this plate, this bowl, is part of its history. We shouldn't hide it. We should embrace it. So they paint gold over it, or they use gold adhesive to put it back together. So to use this philosophy onto us or onto perfectionism is that as human beings, we have our past, we've made our mistakes, we have setbacks, we have things that are like our brokenness. And instead of trying to hide that, we should embrace that we're an imperfect person. And as we embrace that, it can look beautiful in itself.
Yes.
And so this has been a wonderful philosophy for me to learn how to accept imperfection. And then as a coping mechanism, when I'm dealing with some negative emotions, I get one of these. So I have a stack at home because it became a hobby. So I break it. I use a hammer, I smack it, and it's good to break something when we're not feeling good.
Yes.
And then after that, it releases some of that.
Right.
And then I put it back together. And when I'm putting back together, it takes an hour or two. I'm sitting there. I'm trying to focus on sitting with my emotions as opposed to distracting myself from it. So, but it's not easy to sit with my emotions. But when I'm working with the gold paint, I'm reminding myself, this is a workout session. My emotions are valuable. I'm trying to embrace aspects that I don't like about myself. And that's part of who I am. And that's what I'm trying to grow into.
Yes.
So after I make one of them, it helps calm me down. It helps also for me to learn from my emotions. What is this teaching me?
Right.
Are there lessons that my emotions are telling me?
Right. That's really a beautiful picture. Kenneth, how does all this connect for you as you've thought about this theologically? Clearly, only God is perfect. But given that, then we nevertheless live in a world of, right now, extraordinary pervasive fear around the globe. Overwhelming sense of the scale of everything is so enormous and only growing in its scale that the significance of individual action, personal action in your own particular domain, can often feel completely impossible as a place from which to try to do something that, quote, matters in the world, by which I'm not referring to fame or money or power. I'm just meaning a sense of healthy well-being in the world, that you're trying to carry out action, but the system and the scale and the theory and the anger and the division can overwhelm, I think, almost anyone. And in the context of that, it can feel like, I don't think I'm trying to feel for how do you help people not be stopped by perfection, but how to be able to start in light of the scale of the demands of a performance that would actually matter. So I'm curious, from a theological point of view, at this moment of inflection, when we're already in this already for quite a season, and it would seem to me that there's a good chance that there's a long season of this moment, this kind of cultural moment in the U.S., but also globally, and it's in a variety of different ways, can also be found. So how does the Christian faith speak into a moment like this in a way that is not naive, that's not deflective, and that is full of what Jesus says is grace and truth?
Yeah. I think you asked an excellent question. I think a lot of people, including me, worry about what's happening in the world and what our future is like. And I think many times we wonder, how do we matter? What can we do that will have an impact? I think that's another existential question. And I think in terms of so for perfectionists, they probably have higher, more lofty goals of what they define as an impact. So I think if the goals are unrealistic, it would be hard, because no matter how hard you try, you just can't. And then I think even if the goals are not like ambitious and stuff, it was normal goals, I think there's also many factors that we can't control. The environment, the society, what's happening. And it's not just in our little room, our little lab, or even psychologically, we can't control our emotions, but let alone what's happening in the world. And I think for Christians, using a theological lens to look at this, I would say two parts. I think knowing our limitation, that as Christians, we should be like branches connected to the vine, which is Jesus, God. And then so it's not about just us trying to do things, but it's us staying connected to God so that we become vessels.
Yes.
So it's less so about us using our efforts and just making change. So I think it takes some of the responsibilities out of us.
Right.
And I think another part is how to deal with the messiness of this world. And I think especially for perfectionists, we don't like messiness. We like things to be good, to be predictable. But I think one thing I think about, or the way I cope about it, is that God also sees this. If God can tolerate, I don't think he's a perfect God, and even a perfect God can tolerate these things happening. I know there's larger pictures, or God sees things from a different perspective. So maybe I should learn to let go of it a little bit. So those are some of the thoughts.
Yeah.
And I think another thing is when we think about wanting to make change or wanting to control things or beyond our control or achieve things, I remember a quote by our colleague, Jeff Bjork.
Yes.
He shared this quote with me. He says, "Preserving illusory self-sufficiency is most easily done by self-blame, paid for the currency of shame." So in other words, sometimes we have the illusion that we can achieve this or do that. And then we don't want to give up that illusion, so we blame ourselves.
Yes.
And then we feel shameful that we're incapable of doing things. So I thought that was brilliant in terms of how shame is actually dealing with our illusions. And I think it's important to give up our illusions, and I think focus more on God.
Right.
And I think this is more theoretically how to do. I know it's sometimes easily said than done, because the reality is what we see in our everyday life, and we still need to cope with emotions.
Right.
But I think from a theological standpoint, these are the things that come to mind.
Right. It is striking to me that earlier you spoke about how part of this inner sense of inadequacy is about something that has partly to do with externals, but mostly has to do with something that a person is trying to cope with in their own inner being about how they think the world, or at least their world, their life, should be ordered. And they're trying to get it, quote, right.
Yes.
And that means both being right and doing right in whatever criteria that a person might have for those things. And certainly from a Christian point of view, there can be a moralizing influence in that can push people to a kind of impossible moral standard.
Yeah.
But or just human standard of ordinary behavior, as well as a standard of moral perfection. But it can also actually be the invitation, which I think is part of what the scriptures invite us to, which in the language of the psalmist is to allow God to lead us into the broad place rather than the narrow place. And the broad place of God's grace that sees and hears and understands and holds the whole story, like the kintsugi bowl.
Yeah.
That God's hand holding the kintsugi bowl is the full narrative. The kintsugi bowl can be under just our own autonomous regulation, if you want to put it that way, regulating. Whereas the kintsugi bowl in God's hand is a way of trying to metaphorically describe the sense that even when it's all put back together, the greater goodness of it all is that it all matters to God and is beautiful to God in its brokenness, its unfinishedness, when it was not yet put together, when you've shattered the bowl at home and you're sitting in your emotion, but it is not yet put together. There's also grace in that, and not just in the finishing of the kintsugi bowl, where it's all, as it were, quote, perfectly put together again as the imperfect bowl.
Yeah, that's very well said. Yeah, the whole process, I think God accepts and embraces even the process when it's not put together.
Yeah. So, Kenneth, I understand that you've started something at Fuller that's called the Imperfect Culture Lab. I love that name. Tell us about where it came from and also what work it's doing.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. And it's a unique name, but when I was thinking about what most represents the research that I do, the two main ones are perfectionism and then cross-cultural research, looking at how people adjust and the well-beings of going to a different culture. So I wanted the name to represent both. And of course, I didn't want to say it's a perfect lab. And I think for perfectionists, the goal is to accept and embrace imperfection.
Yes.
So I wanted the imperfect in there. So we call it Imperfect Culture Lab. And also, I think on a broader sense, cultures are different and cultures are also imperfect. So being able to accept that our culture is imperfect, other cultures are imperfect, and to celebrate and embrace differences, I think, is important. Not so much which is right, which is wrong.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that's a great note for us to end on. We all live then in our own imperfect culture labs, whether it's the culture of our own inner being or our family or the context that we've been raised in or the places where we live. It's an imperfect picture. And there's a place for excellence and there's a place for freedom and embrace that isn't about doing or being something that deserves those things, but simply recipients of an abundance that is God's character and grace. So thank you so much for this work you're doing. I think it's extremely important and very, very important to see how this continues to unfold. Because as far as I can tell, perfectionism is not going away. It's only intensifying. And so may it be the case that your work continues to flourish.
Yeah, I really appreciate this time talking about this. I appreciate your insight in just the space and the conversation and how it flowed. Direct me to share and also reflect. Thank you, Mark.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.